Welcome to part 4 of the Eisenhower era. Now we're going to talk about a rebellious youth. One of the things that the youth of the 1950s really embraced was the evolution that took place in music, right? In the 1940s, you had the big swing bands like Glenn Miller, and then you had the individual singers like Frank Sinatra and Patti Page. And in jazz, you had three major groups. You had traditional jazz, mainstream jazz, and modern jazz. But you start to see evolutions during this decade. For example, country music becomes a little bit more diverse. You're going to have cowboy songs, western swing, honky-tonk, and bluegrass. But then you're also going to have a suburbanized form of country music called the Nashville song. The African American communities listened to blues and jazz, but they also started to listen to a blended version of it that takes on the name rhythm and blues, R&B, right? Of course, gospel music still is very popular, but all, of course, these forms of music pale in comparison when compared to rock and roll. Rock and roll is quite literally a collision between the Nashville sound and rhythm and blues. Right, and that's why you see so much diversity in these pioneers in rock and roll music. Right, if you take a look at just who I have up here now, Bill Haley and the Comets, there in the upper left-hand corner. 1954, they recorded the rock and roll hit "Rock Around the Clock." Right, 1952, Cleveland's Alan Freed, a disc jockey, was playing Moondog's Rock and Roll Party. Right, so it was already taken off. Other pioneers include Chuck Berry, right? Fats Domino, Jerry Lee Lewis, Buddy Holly, all kinds of different sounds. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the king himself, right? Elvis Presley, right? A Mississippi-born singer and guitarist who had a very unique look and unique sound, but when you really take a look at him, you see it's a blend of all of this stuff. He was once asked by a music and entertainment writer, "Who do you sound like?" And he said, "Well, I don't sound like nobody," right? Now, America's youth ate this up. They really loved rock and roll music, and it became just part of their identity. Now, this generation of kids are also growing up more independent than ever before, right? Which is going to set some of the older generations a bit on edge. In 1957, Collier's magazine is going to say, "Never in our 180-year history has the United States ever been so aware of or confused about its teenagers." I always find that statement a little bit ironic because as a parent myself who has one child who would qualify as a millennial and three that would qualify as Gen Z, I find them equally as confusing, I would bet. But at any rate, this generation of kids do have something that previous generations didn't have, and that was a disposable income. They actually had cash to burn as well, just like their middle-class parents. And they spent them on things like rock and roll music, cars, comic books, right? They began wearing blue jeans. They began taking these cars, older cars, and tricking them out, making them into hot rods. They began having premarital sex. They were attracted to rebellious movies like James Dean and Rebel Without a Cause from 1955, or Marlon Brando and The Wild Ones from 1953, right? The response to this is you're actually going to have American adults push back, right? For example, schools will get rid of blue jeans and impose dress codes. The Senate, the U.S. Senate, is actually going to create a subcommittee called the Subcommittee to Investigate Juvenile Delinquency, and it's going to focus on the corrupting power of mass media. See, the media made them do it, right? Ironically, this youth was not nearly as rebellious as this greatest generation had perceived. For example, let's look at Elvis Presley, right? He's iconic, as he was described by one journalist. He's everything about this rebellious youth, right? The central mouth, the disheveled duck-ass haircut with his gyrating hips, and this symbolization of sexuality. But when you know who Elvis was himself, he was very soft-spoken, very polite, very devoted to his parents. Now, one group that is perhaps more rebellious or more legitimately rebellious was a small group known as the Beatniks. The Beatniks was part of a beat movement. The beat movement originated in New York City in the late 1940s, and expressed both alienation and hope, right? The term beat referred to them feeling exhausted, beaten down by society, right? And so their mantra, if you will, was to emote and soak up the world. They rejected this consumer culture, the consumer culture of bright colors and all this exuberance. They would wear black. They would explore their sexuality. They began pursuing Eastern religions. And for the first time, you really start seeing extensive use of mind-altering drugs. I know we tend to think, oh, LSD and stuff, that's the hippie movement of the 60s. No, it's really the beatnik movement of the 1950s.